The presentation is most specifically about illustration and interpretation and how conventional illustrations come to shut down that interpretation with examples drawn primarily from nursery rhymes. We'll focus intensely on Humpty Dumpty as an example of this, but more broadly this issue is about educating the imagination and helping us figure out how, with higher order thinking, we want to open up opportunities for interpretation and critical approaches to texts, which is to say that we want people to be able to think, and when illustration stops us from thinking, we want to be able to challenge it. And most kids with these traditional texts, I like to use these as examples because most kids who have been spending time in English-speaking schools or who've been raised in English-speaking homes will have some kind of a starting point, less of a distance to have background knowledge helping you with this. In addition, many kids from multicultural families and backgrounds will also have collections of rhymes, folklore, songs, lullabies, other things that are really conventional and typical for their other cultures. So it's worth it to explore these traditional texts because many cultural backgrounds will bring these your direction in education. So, Humpty Dumpty is a prime example of how nursery rhyme illustrations have become conventional and gives us some clear examples of how text and image work back and forth with one another and how conventional images will shut down our ability to interpret. So I've got three specific techniques that I'll be presenting on how to reopen that interpretation, and we'll finish out with just some general ideas on why we might care about this generally in education. So first thing is to just take a moment and answer the question, what comes to mind when I ask, what is Humpty Dumpty? Or if I recite the rhyme, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. Do you have an image that comes immediately to mind? If you were raised in an English-speaking family or school system, you likely have an image that comes to mind. Did you see this egg image come to your mind? If so, you're part of the culture of conventionality around nursery rhymes. But if you look at those words, you'll see that the rhyme itself, which existed for a long time, for hundreds of years before it was ever illustrated, doesn't say anything about it being an egg, although an egg clearly fits the answer here as something that could fall and not be able to be put together again. But it could be lots of other things. So it's the conventionality of the illustration that tells us what the meaning of the words is, and when we have that image jump to our minds so quickly, we know that it's the illustration that's bossing around our interpretation and that it stops us from coming up with other interpretations. So three different ways to reopen this potential for interpretation. One is to just ask, what else could fit these words? Given the words alone, a couple of favorites from my students are listed here in the center of the PowerPoint presentation. And after finishing this with a couple dozen students as an interview process asking what else could it be, Clay, my helper, turned to me after the responses were all done and said it could be anything as long as it's breakable. And that fits the rhyme. The rhyme doesn't say it's something that's breakable or broken, but it does have the fall in there, and it has the idea that it can't be put back together again. So Clay made a very strong inference there based on the words and pulled away from that traditional illustration. And so did all of the other kids with their responses and alternate visualizations. So the second thing we can do beyond saying what do the words offer us is to really just dig into the history of a nursery rhyme. And if you want avenues into the history of a nursery rhyme, the best thing to do is to get Peter and Iona Opie's Oxford Dictionary of Nursery Rhymes, which has interpretations and histories for hundreds of these old English nursery rhymes. So can we find out just by digging into the history when the egg image became conventional and how it became conventional and why it's conventional? In all of my digging, I've scanned through dozens and dozens of image databases and Mother Goose collections, and followed the lead of George Shannon, who wrote a historical book on Humpty Dumpty that's available from used bookstores. You might want to look into that if you're really interested. But we're looking at Maxfield Parrish's 1927 Life magazine, Easter magazine cover. And this is the point in time from which I was not able, after 1927, to find any illustration of Humpty Dumpty that did not fit this form. And it's a standard egg as the body and head together, a big egg-shaped body / head with arms and legs kind of sticking out of this egg shape. And Maxfield Parrish did borrow this image pretty strongly from John Tenniel from about 3 decades earlier with Alice's Adventures Through the Looking Glass. But it was Maxfield Parrish's celebrity in the 20s that really made this stick. And up until the late 1920s, when movies switched over to talking pictures, illustrators, magazine illustrators in particular, were some of the most famous media stars in the United States and Europe, because they were the ones who were getting into everybody's homes and giving them these powerful images to look at. So 4-color printing for magazines came along quite a bit before radio and television and talking movies. And so this illustration had a huge hold. It grabbed a hold of the American and British psyche pretty strongly. So here are some examples from the survey that I did of nursery rhyme and Mother Goose books. And every single one of these examples has elements that were borrowed from that Maxfield Parrish image. We tend to have that egg as the body and head, with limbs sticking out of an egg-shaped body head, and really usually in spiffy clothes. So somebody who's got a stiff collar, a tie, and some clothes that give a sense of neatness, tidiness, and so on, and maybe a little bit of uppity or conceitedness, something like that. So dozens and dozens of images I've collected hold to that convention, but all of them after that Maxfield Parrish illustration. So the fame of that Maxfield Parrish illustration and its widespread distribution through popular culture explains how this happened, that before Maxfield Parrish came along and really standardized this, there were multiple interpretations possible. And that's what we'll look at now. Before Maxfield Parrish in 1927, Humpty Dumpty was not a fixed quantity. Kate Greenaway in the 1880s, in her nursery rhyme collection, used a child to represent Humpty Dumpty. The wall itself may look fairly typical, and we have Humpty Dumpty perched up on top of a high wall, but this time it's a child. Walter Crane's illustration from around the same time, the 1870s to 1880s, used Richard III, the British king, who was well known to have a hunchback. And this illustration, again, is more of a personage or a historical figure. This is one that I find many college students often bring up in class because it not only makes sense to say that a political figure can fall from grace and not be able to recover again, but it also gives us a connection to the line about the king's horses and the king's men and so on. So it's a consistent interpretation. The next one is from the Dalziel brothers, who were the engravers that worked with John Tenniel on the Alice series, and this one borrows on the egg imagery but makes the egg into the head and leaves the body much looking like a human body. Each one of these images is thematically dark when you think about it. The whimsy and the happiness and the sort of happy-go-lucky attitude that Maxfield Parrish's image has to it is definitely not there across these. Each of them has an interpretation with some difficulty and some darkness to it. 1843 is the earliest known illustration for Humpty Dumpty, and this helps us think about opening the possibilities for interpretation, because this illustration actually has 3 possible interpretations wrapped up in it. When we go back in the Oxford English Dictionary to find out what the earliest uses of the words Humpty Dumpty were in English print, we find that in the 1600s this was a mixed drink of brandy and ale. A Humpty Dumpty was a mixed drink. And up in the left-hand corner there we have this little figure drinking that drink on top of the wall. The second interpretation of this, going into the 1700s, was that a person who was drinking a drink like this came to be known as a Humpty Dumpty, and a Humpty Dumpty was a man who was portly, a little bit round-shaped, kind of a fat with the red drunk nose, sort of this typical vision of a portly drunkard, and this person would be called a Humpty Dumpty. So then finally, in the 1700s and 1800s, we also have the nursery rhyme suggesting a riddle, and that the answer to the riddle was an egg. So we have all 3 of these interpretations possible here. We have the drink, the drunkard, and the egg all in one illustration. This is a very fun version of the rhyme. It's a fold-out toy book from 1843, and you can see it folding out into onto the right-hand side of the page. It folds out to be about 6 feet wide. Let's see, this popular understanding that there are multiple interpretations, at least 3 of them viable back in the old days, disappeared after Maxfield. So, illustration contributes to this process of opening or shutting down interpretation, and I'm just going to show you a few ways that this actually matters in other children's literature and literature in general. One example that I want to go to is the farm. The other is going to be the stable, the image from the Nativity in the Bible, the New Testament, and the other is just the idea of what counts as a hero. So a busy day at the farm. This book cover from children's literature shows us a really typical farm, which is a farm that involves all the farm animals and a farmer and a big old red barn where all of the animals live together. And what I know from my background, personal background, I grew up on a ranch, is that most frequently a ranch or a farm will focus on 1, maybe 2 kinds of production. A person who is an egg farmer will only have the chickens that do the eggs and do exclusively that kind of farming. A dairy farmer will do almost only dairy farming, and so on. And although family farms like this do exist, it's a throwback to the late 1800s and early 1900s to have a typical family working farm like this. Many towns and cities have a museum farm that runs like this to help us experience what family farm life was like. But in general, if we want to help kids understand what farming is in our economy and our culture, this is a really strange, biased approach to things that may not really reflect the way things are. And children's book illustrations do that. So it's a bias that's perpetuated that way. The stable, if you go to the New Testament and read accounts of the Nativity, you will find that there is no place in the words that it ever says there was a stable. The manger that the animals eat out of, where the baby was put to rest, is the only thing that's given in the text there to suggest that. And in looking at historical and cultural illustrations and so on, you can see that it's just as likely that this may have happened outdoors as underneath a roof or inside walls of any kind. But illustrations and sculptures and so on almost exclusively give us a picture of a stable. The next thing is to think about what counts as a hero, and so I'm going to comic book illustrations here. We have Peter Parker from early Spider-Man comic book, and more recently, in the 2000s, Marvel published a version of Peter Parker that was offering us a different ethnicity. So race and ethnicity are a couple of things in illustration where if we go back into the 20th century, the depiction of a hero was almost exclusively white males. And I think Spider-Man even recently has taken the franchise into offering a female hero version of Spider-Man. So an interesting thing to think about how gender stereotypes and gender typical roles figured into what heroes were. And these illustrations really tipped things that direction. Marvel has been trying to tip readers away from those biases in recent years. So each of the three approaches I've gone through here is a way of reopening a closed text and an illustration that has become the canon. It's become exactly just the way things are, conventional and traditional. And that has happened through mass production of those texts in printing and has taken away from us the ability to pass on those texts as traditions that have multiple interpretations. So each of the approaches that I walked you through coaches us into revisualizing and reinterpreting and so on. And this historical process that we've talked about is as important as the individual psychology and development processes, because historical processes end up driving what's possible for us. So sometimes we need to pick those apart for our kids. So I bring this out here. I'll let you look at those last few slides. Not only is this important for us in thinking about the traditional texts of nursery rhymes, but think about the way that visuals from movies or books that you've read dominate your ability to visualize traditional fairy tales or folk tales. Are you able to visualize Cinderella? Are you able to visualize Rapunzel? Or do those movie images get in and dominate right away? If not movie images, is it a childhood a collection of folk tales or fairy tales or Mother Goose rhymes that dominates your visualization process? And then also many of the world's scripture traditions have illustrations that tend to kind of overdo or overinterpret for us. So not just the critique of the images as we have them throughout history, but also then learning to make mental images of our own instead of merely consuming them turns us into people who are using higher order thinking and critical thinking to approach literature. So in review, the three techniques: questioning with the words, dipping into a historical inquiry and going through lots of the pictures and images that might help us, and finding places that account that history for us. And also visualization, doing exercises with visualizing with alternate texts in the same tradition that aren't already wrapped up in a traditional illustration. Connections outwards to other areas that you might think about in education and the world in general. Neurologists such as John Medina are telling us in the review of the research on neurology that almost everyone is primarily a visual learner, which is to say that those illustrations that we find in picture books or in movies are more likely to get in and dominate our thinking about a text. Combine that with what sociologists have learned about eyewitness identification in police lineups, which is to say that visualizing those pictures that we have in memory are often notoriously incorrect, that when we build a visual of something and are asked to be an eyewitness, sometimes that's not the true vision of things. So our eyes often cheat us that way. So it's definitely something that's worth going back in and questioning and revisioning and reimagining. Memories of live events, when people talk about things that have happened in their lives, the talk often shapes their visual memory of what actually happened. And words shape and determine the potential for visualization. So it works both ways. Sometimes the words that we say will dominate the visuals that we're able to come up with, and vice versa. In personal family histories and so on, often the photographs that we have tend to determine what sorts of stories we will tell. The last thing is that informational text is out there in great quantity now for young children, and it tends to be highly visual. National Geographic has led the trend on this in putting a huge dominant visual in the center of the page of informational text to get us thinking about the story and maybe wanting to read a little bit more about it. But we should probably think about the way those dominant visuals might narrow our approach to an informational topic. One last thing that Matt Downey, a professor emeritus of history at UNC, he found this photograph in the Colorado Historical Society collection, and it's often used in textbooks and paper presentations to present the idea that child labor was a big problem back in the early 1900s. But all the analysis that he was able to do of this showed that it was probably just a staged presentation of miners' children in Colorado who were doing a skit or a fun play about mining at their school. And among the clues that they used were just some of the things that you can see here. The one that he noticed the most was that these lunch pails don't appear to be weighted down with water. Most of these old lunch pails that these kids are carrying would have had about a gallon's worth of water in them, cold water, which was underneath and kept the food cool, but was also the miners' drinking water for the day. And these kids are really just kind of throwing these lunch pails around like they're empty. So it's not kids who are getting ready to go down in the mines necessarily. Anyway, visuals often deceive us. So